Next up, I have my interview with Dr. Thomas Cowan, who's a medical doctor, a unique thinker, and also the co-author of a book called The Contagion Myth, subtitled Why Viruses, including the coronavirus, are not the cause of disease. We need free thinkers like this in the world to be able to give us a different viewpoint and expand our context and understanding for what's really going on. So enjoy my interview with Dr. Thomas Cowan. Dr. Cowan, thanks so much for being here with us today and taking your time to explain your point of view about things. Let's get started here. Tell us a bit about your background.
My name is Tom Cowan, and I used to be a medical doctor, and now I'm retired. I do something that some people would call work, which is that I write about and speak about health issues. And so that's, I think, what most people are interested in, what I think about those things.
Let me get your big picture view of the coronavirus. How do you think it all got started and where we are today? Give me your thoughts about this.
So in order to understand this, what's called COVID-19, we need to be very clear on terms and what we're talking about. Otherwise, we can make a mess of this. So COVID-19 is the name of the disease, which is supposedly a new disease. And the coronavirus, otherwise known as SARS-CoV-2, is supposedly the virus that causes COVID-19. So that's the basic. So in order to understand this, we have to understand how a biologist, a virologist, or a medical doctor proves causation with a virus. That's the first step. So we should go back and say, how did the medical community determine that the disease COVID-19 is caused by this new coronavirus? And really, so the first step is, when I ask people that, because they've heard me have a dissenting position, and I'll say, why do you think that this coronavirus is causing COVID-19? They usually say things like, well, there's a lot of people who died in New York City, or a lot of people who died of China, and then it spread to North Korea. Or there's a lot of people in a nursing home, or my Aunt Bessie went to a party and then she got it. And then on and on and on. So the problem is, these are what are called epidemiological observations. And there is not a reputable scientist or medical doctor in the world who thinks you prove viral causation with epidemiology. In other words, if you or anyone out there thinks that the proof that a disease is caused by a virus because a lot of people in the same place died of a similar disease, then you must think that Hiroshima was a virus. Because I can tell you a lot of people died in the same place of the same thing, and as far as I know, nobody thinks that was a virus. So then you could say, well, yes, but what if it spreads? That proves it's a virus. So there was also an event called Chernobyl, where they blew off a nuclear reactor, and then it started spreading all over Eastern and then Western Europe, and thousands and maybe millions of people got sick with the same thing. And so this spread, and as far as anybody thinks, nobody thinks that's a virus. Here's another example. Back in the 17 and 18, 1600s, a lot of sailors on ships, one after another, they had their teeth fall out and then they died of heart failure. And for 200 years, they thought that must be caused by some spreadable microbe that they couldn't see. And then one day somebody ate a lime and the whole thing went away because it was scurvy. And the point is, you cannot prove viral causation with epidemiology. And it has consequences if you're wrong. We thought beriberi and pellagra, which killed millions, was caused by an unseen microbe because the epidemiology was there. A bunch of families got it, and then the next family got it. And it turns out it was a nutritional deficiency. So there is nobody who thinks that epidemiology proves viral causation. Nobody. And anybody who says, I think this is a virus because Uncle Fred went to a party and he got sick, that's a unscientific, they're basically scientifically illiterate if they say that. And I have gotten to the point where I say we have enough epidemiological evidence with COVID-19 that we should investigate a microbial cause. Now, we also have enough epidemiological evidence to investigate many other causes like electromagnetic field toxicity and air pollution and a bunch of other things. None of those prove that those are the cause either. But the purpose of epidemiology, of these observations, is to generate hypotheses that you can test in the lab. Okay, so now that we've got that clear, so I don't need anybody to tell me more epidemiological observations. We've already decided that we're going to investigate viral causation. Now, how do you investigate viral causation? It's interesting that all these tens and maybe even hundreds of people who tell me they're sure that they know that this is caused by a virus, when I ask them the simple question of how do you go about proving viral causation? I mean, I could ask you that. Do you know? No. I've not met one person who even knows actually how to answer that question, let alone knows what the answer is, which means they have no idea. Now, let me just say that again. 100% of the people who just a minute ago told me that they're sure this is caused by a virus don't even know how you would go about doing that. Now, that should be shocking to people, because if you're listening and you don't know how to do it, then you have no idea whether it's been done or not. By the way, I didn't know this as well as I do now until about a year ago. In fact, I've said things and written things which were incorrect because I didn't know the science of this as well as I should have. And the only reason I point that out is I can pretty much guarantee that your family doctor and your internist and your surgeon doesn't know this either. And now that may be shocking to people, but I didn't learn any of this in medical school or any training. This one has to figure out for themselves. So here's the way. First of all, you have to isolate the virus. So take an example of, we want to do an experiment, and please listen carefully to my words here. We want to do an experiment to see if the caffeine in coffee beans causes high blood pressure, right? So let's do an experiment. And I'm not going to say this each time, but let's say we do proper controls, proper placebos, everything about the study is good. So we take coffee beans and we grind them up and we put them in a capsule and we give them to 10 people and all of their blood pressure goes up and none of the placebo do. Have we now proven that the caffeine in coffee beans causes high blood pressure? The answer for any rational person would be no. Because unless you think the only thing in a coffee bean is caffeine, which you can prove isn't correct, there's fiber and caffeic acid and aromatic oils and probably 100 other things, you have not identified that it's the caffeine that causes high blood pressure. Okay, so let's take it a step further. Let's, like we do with coffee, we put it through a filter paper and we put water through it and we drip it through, and that catches the ground part, right? And you throw away the ground part, and now you know, because you know that caffeine is water soluble, you know that the caffeine is in the liquid part. So you give 10 people the coffee, 10 people controls. Have you now proven that it's the caffeine in the coffee beans that causes high blood pressure? The answer of any sane, rational person would be no. Because again, there's a lot more things in coffee than just caffeine, obviously. There's flavor and oils and all minerals, etc. Okay, so we want to be very clear and precise because we're talking science here. So we do some technique, and there are many of them in modern chemistry and modern biology, where you pull out just the caffeine from the coffee, right? So you can do it through a centrifuge, and it comes out in a certain band. You suck the band out. The next thing is you have to prove to people that the only thing you have is caffeine, right? So you do a chemical analysis. There's no caffeic acid. There's no aromatic oils. All you have is pure chemical caffeine. And you publish, this is the steps I did. This is all we have. And you publish the independent analysis. This lab has said in this sample, all there is caffeine. You give it to 10 people, their blood pressure goes up. Have you now proven it? The answer is yes. That's how we do science. Now, the reason I say that is because that's almost exactly how we isolate and purify a virus. And where am I getting this from? Well, I'm getting this from 20 years of research from about 1935 to 1954, where they did this exact procedure. They took people like with chicken pox, and they ground up their snot or their vesicle, fluid, and they had the basically macerated cells. Now that's not the virus any more than that's caffeine. So then they put it through a filter, and the filter would catch the bacteria and the cells and tissues and all the big stuff, and then you would have the virus and a lot of other things. That's still not the virus. Then they would put it in a centrifuge, which separates things by weight, and the virus, because it has a certain weight, separates out into a band. And then they would suck out the band, and they would show you with an electron microscope picture, this is all we have, pure virus. Then they would expose an animal to that virus, and none of them got sick. 20 years. They exposed every type of, quote, viral illness they could find. They isolated and purified the virus. No animal or human got sick, and they said, basically, there's nothing to this. Now, here's the shocking thing, and I'm about to sort of prove it to you. Nobody has isolated a coronavirus from anybody with COVID-19. How do I know that? Let's say what the CDC says about this. These are excerpts from published papers. The first one is from July 13th, 2020. It's from the CDC 2019 Novel Coronavirus Real-Time RT-PCR Diagnostic Panel on 39. So this is their report on the state of science of what we know about this COVID-19 and coronavirus. They say, quote, since no quantified virus isolates of the 2019 nCoV virus are currently available. So what does that mean? It means the CDC, as of July, has never isolated the virus. Now, sometimes when I give talks about this, I remind people that a virus is a thing, right? Like a fork. I usually have a fork, but I don't have a fork. We're not talking about a thought or a feeling. We're talking about a thing, like a chair or a fork. Every fork can be isolated. Every fork, if I have 3 forks, can be quantified. This is 3 forks. If you say no quantified viral isolates are available, you've never isolated the virus from anybody with COVID-19. Now, are they the only ones? So here's an excerpt of the paper called Detection of the 2019 Novel Coronavirus by Real-Time RT-PCR. This is the paper published in a peer-reviewed journal called European Surveillance that inaugurated the pandemic, so-called. This was by Christian Drosten and a bunch of other virologists, and they were tasked with developing a test for this new coronavirus. So let's see what they say. this is quoting from the paper, the ongoing outbreak of a recently emerged novel coronavirus poses a challenge for public health laboratories as virus isolates are unavailable. In other words, they were tasked with making a test for a virus, and they have no examples of the virus to start with. That's like if I asked you to make a test for a unicorn, you might ask me, can I see a unicorn? And I might say no. And you might say, well, how am I supposed to make a test to find a little piece of a unicorn when I don't know what a unicorn looks like or what a unicorn is made of? And then I might say to you, here's $1 million, do it anyways. And then they go on to say, quote, we aim to develop and deploy robust diagnostic methodology for use in public health laboratory settings without having virus material available. They had no virus to make a test to find a piece of the virus. Therefore, their PCR test, the test which is being used all over the world to document cases, is a complete fraud. They have never isolated a virus and said, this is a unique piece of that virus, because they have no virus. Now, are they the only ones? Here's a quote from Pfizer about making their RNA vaccine. To build an RNA vaccine, scientists do not need the actual virus. In other words, Pfizer admits they have no virus with which to make a vaccine against. They call it an actual virus, as opposed to, I guess, a theoretical virus. Now, I would change the word theoretical to say an imaginary virus or a make-believe virus. So they're using a make-believe virus which they have never isolated, they don't know the sequence of, they don't know the components of, to make a vaccine against this virus, and God only knows what they're making a vaccine against. Here's another one, a paper published in Nature, which was one of the first papers on describing the novel coronavirus. And a friend of mine named Torsten Engelbrecht asked him, because he says he isolated the virus. And people have sent me about 20 different peer-reviewed articles claiming they isolated the virus. When you look at the paper, it's very clear that nobody has ever isolated the virus. It's a fraud. And we asked him, did you isolate the virus? He said, quote, we did not obtain an electron micrograph showing the degree of purification. In other words, they didn't do what every peer-reviewed journal article has to do, which is say, here's the steps we did, here's the picture showing that we have an isolated virus. They didn't even take a picture. And they admit they didn't isolate the virus. Here's another one. Same thing. Identification of a coronavirus isolated from a patient in Korea with COVID-19. This was published by the Korean Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Essentially, it's the CDC of Korea. So we asked him, did you isolate the virus? Because that's what it says in the title. In the quote, the answer was, quote, we could not estimate the degree of purification because we did not purify and concentrate the virus. In other words, they have no virus. Here's another one. Again, isolation of the new virus. Quote, we show an image of sedimented virus particle, not purified one. The Canadian Health Ministry, in Freedom of Information request, do you have any information on an isolation of this virus? Their answer, quote, having completed a thorough search, we regret to inform you that we are unable to locate any records responsive to your request. None of these groups who are organizing this have any example of an isolated virus. If you've never isolated the virus, you have no way of knowing whether it causes disease. Period. And the test to identify a virus that you've never isolated is not false positive or false negative. It's just good old-fashioned false. It's meaningless. So that's where we are. So I could go into how they misled themselves into thinking they have this virus, but this is a scientific fraud. And interestingly, just 3 days ago, a group of European virologists and pathologists dissected this Drosten study and said the basis of using this study, which is the basis of all the PCR tests, all the testing, is pure scientific fraud, and they demanded that this journal retract the article.
So then explain to me what's going on. I mean, there's cases reported, there's deaths reported, et cetera. How is this all happening and being reported on if there's not a virus?
First of all, what are these people seeing at the site? What is a virus? So that's where it gets very interesting, because it actually leads you into understanding what is going on. Because in certain cases, like chickenpox, you do see these particles. I can show you a picture of them if you want, and they are at the site of the disease. But we already know that just because you have strep in your throat doesn't mean it's causing disease. In order to prove causation, you have to isolate the virus, you have to take the chickenpox out, you have to prove that you don't have anything else in there, no poisons, no snot, no nothing, just the virus, expose an animal to it. They did that for 20 years. They couldn't make any animal sick. So the question is, what is it doing there? And it's a very interesting question, because it gets into the question of, how do we even know it's coming from the outside? Because it turns out that when you have tissue, as I described earlier, and you starve it and poison it, it packages up little pieces of degraded DNA and packages them up in particles as a detoxification and communication strategy. In other words, if you break down the tissue, there's a poison relief mechanism which we have erroneously called viruses. They're coming from the inside. They're called exosomes, or intracellular vesicles. Now, there's an article in a journal called Viruses which looked at this question: how do we know that these are from the outside and not from the inside? And they said something very interesting. However, to date, a reliable method that can actually guarantee a separation of exosomes from viruses does not exist. Everything that's a thing can be separated and isolated from every other thing. If I have a fork here, I can separate it from a spoon because they're different. There's only one reason I can't separate an exosome, which is a detoxification strategy from the inside, from a pathogenic virus from the outside, and that's because they're the same thing. And that's why I can't separate them. So, in other words, something is poisoning the tissue then packages up this degraded genetic material. We mistakenly call those pathogenic viruses. And here's where it gets interesting, because we now know that those pieces of genetic material can resonate out into the world as a signal for other organisms that something bad has happened, some poisoning has happened, and you should defend yourself. This is how trees communicate. If you get beetles eating a tree, they put out chemicals and other signals that communicate to the other trees that there's beetles around, and you should defend yourself. This is because the Darwinian model of evolution, based on mutations and survival of the fittest, is pure nonsense, because it's way too slow. If you were exposed to glyphosate and one person had a mutation that allowed them to survive from that exposure, you know how long it would take for that to spread through the whole population? Like 10,000 years, if that, even from Boston, for God's sake. So nature has another mechanism which is called viruses or exosomes. So you package up this material, the DNA or RNA has a resonance, just like women communicate with their menstrual cycles through resonance, and a lot of unseen energies communicate through resonance. That's what we call life. And then the other organisms can make the same piece of genetic material and turn that into proteins to defend themselves. So viruses are the mechanism of evolution. They're the mechanism of adaptation. A war on viruses is a war on basically evolution and adaptation. It's a war on life. So the question then is, what is poisoning us? That's the question. Now, when you look at the symptoms of the disease called COVID-19, and you forget about the virus, because the virus has never been isolated, it's basically imaginary. So any therapeutic so-called maneuver, like wearing a mask or social distancing or washing your hands to get rid of something that's basically hasn't even been proven to exist, is just nonsense. And that it doesn't work at all, it just makes you sicker. So what do we know about the disease? Now, most of it is of what are being called cases are just PCR tests, which mean nothing. And I mean nothing. There is no false positives here, because you cannot use that test without having compared it to an intact virus. So a case means nothing. So there are sick people. Now, most of the sick people are just the usual sort of sick people. But there are some sick people who are hypoxic and have what's called a hyperinflammatory state. Now, how do they get hypoxic? It has nothing to do with any virus. Viruses don't make you hypoxic. But we do know from clear scientific research going back to the 70s, the Naval Intelligence Research Institute did this, the Soviets did it, there was recent papers on it, that if you expose a place to millimeter waves, otherwise known as 5G, three things will happen. One, you'll degrade the oxygen in the atmosphere. So you're essentially, like this one ER doctor said, it's like these people are walking up the Himalayas. I think his name was Kyle Seidel. He said they're in a low oxygen environment, but yet they're in New York City or Wuhan or on a cruise ship that had just had 5G installed. And what's happening is the millimeter waves are degrading the oxygen in the atmosphere, so they're actually like they're on the top of a mountain. The second thing is it interferes with the certain pathways in your mitochondria, which are organelles in your tissues, that use oxygen to make fuel. We know this, again, going back to research from the 70s. So you become tissue hypoxic, you're starving of oxygen because A, there's less oxygen in the atmosphere, and B, you can't use the oxygen that you do have and turn it into fuel, which is the whole point of oxygen in the first place. So that's another thing that happens as a direct result of exposure to millimeter waves, along with, aluminum in the air and air pollution and fear and bad food and lots of things. But the millimeter wave's the new kid on the block. And the third thing it does, which we know, is it creates a hyperinflammatory response, otherwise known as a cytokine storm, which is the body's way of getting rid of diseased tissue. It's not a disease, but basically we're talking about radiation sickness. So you radiate the tissue with millimeter waves, it breaks down, the body says, I have to get rid of this. It uses the same mechanism that we get rid of cigarette smoke or splinters. You create an inflammatory response, which the unfortunate doctors, alternative and otherwise, say, oh, you have too much inflammation. That's your disease. Inflammation is your body's only way of getting rid of dead and diseased tissue. But it can be so overwhelming that it actually kills you. So you die from hypoxia and an over-enthusiastic inflammatory response, and that is exactly what fits with COVID-19 from millimeter waves. Now, I would point out that we have the epidemiology for this, we have the mechanism, which I just went through, but people have criticized me for, I'm very particular about viral causation, and we know there has never been the virus isolated, so you can't possibly know if caffeine is causing high blood pressure if you've never isolated the virus and made any animal or person sick. So we know that's not the case, and I actually think we should do clear research to show once and for all whether millimeter waves, otherwise known as 5G, actually cause hypoxia and inflammatory cytokine storm and are basically the reason for this problem. Because if I'm right, then we have two very interesting factors here. Number one, we have a test which we can change the cycles on the test to make more and more people be positive. Because it turns out that the primers are the sequences that they're testing for, right? They have never been linked to a certain virus. It turns out if you do what's called a blast search, where you can look at the Human Genome Project, they list every sequence of genetic sequence found in human beings. There is at last count 93 human sequences which match up exactly with the primers being used for the coronavirus test. In other words, they're testing for whether you're a human. There's also about 90 that come from different bacteria and fungus. So they're testing for whether you're human or a bacteria or a fungus. Now, you could say, well, why doesn't everybody test positive? And the answer for that is it depends on how much degradation you have. If you've been exposed to something that it degrades your DNA, it will show up at a lower amplification cycle. And if you haven't been degraded, you have to do more cycles. But the problem is if you do more than 35 cycles, pretty much everybody starts testing positive. And so in the hands of who's ever interested in this, they can make more cases by turning up the number of amplification cycles. If you turn it up over 40, something like 60 to 80% of the population will have enough degradation that they'll test positive. Suddenly you have a pandemic. And then if you roll out some therapy like a vaccine, and you want to demonstrate that the vaccine reduced the number of cases, all you have to do is reduce the number of cycles, and lo and behold, now only 10% show that they have this. This is a very powerful weapon in certain people's hands. The other problem is you also have a mechanism for making people sick. All you have to do is increase the exposure and the intensity of the millimeter waves, and more people will get sick, which is likely what happened in Wuhan and New York City and the cruise ship and certain hospitals and nursing homes in northern Italy. So we have two controllable factors, the number of cases and the number of people who are actually getting sick. And that's an unprecedented weapon in the hands of people if they choose to use it.
So what if someone tests positive, they quarantine, they go through a couple of weeks of symptoms, et cetera, then they're done with it. Now they don't any longer have any symptoms. They're still exposed to the same electromagnetic radiation, the same environmental toxins. So how do you explain that?
They've used their virus to adapt. Just like any toxin, they've had exposure to a toxin. They then use their virus, they excrete these particles called exosomes to detoxify, to make something new happen, to make themselves more resistant. That's one thing. The other thing is the test means nothing. So if you do 3 tests in a day, you'll get different results because the test means nothing. I keep saying that because if you say there's any biological significance to the test, besides the fact that you're degrading more readily, That's a scientifically invalid conclusion. There is no connection to any virus or any biological process, except to a certain extent that your tissues are degrading. Now, just like any exposure to anything, you get an exposure, your body adapts to it, it creates these detoxification mechanisms called exosomes, and then you hopefully go on your way. That's what we call being sick. So there's a lot of people who have exposure and they, just whatever, they rest and then their body adapts to it. And as long as it's not such a high intensity that would kill them, they basically go on. But that's not the end of the problem, because a lot of the people go on to have chronic symptoms. So they're still being poisoned by these basically electromagnetic fields, along with all the other toxins in the air.
So let's talk about the number of deaths that are being reported. On a normal news cycle, they're constantly reporting, here's the amount of new deaths as a result of COVID. There's more and more of them every single day. They're disseminating this. They're obviously getting their data from somewhere. So all this is being promulgated into the culture about deaths due to COVID. How do you explain this?
I mean, the problem is there is no definition of what COVID is, so they can manipulate, the death certificates to make them whatever they want. Because they've also essentially made a dictum that we're not allowed to do autopsies, except in very rare situations. And in fact, a group of European pathologists who were not allowed to do autopsies and finally did like 100 of them said there is no evidence in any of these autopsies that anybody died from any kind of viral pneumonia. So even people who believe in the whole virus theory say this looks like something else. Everybody who works with these people say this looks like something else. Now the problem is, as I said, the test is positive from degradation from any source. If you have diabetes, if you have heart attacks, if you have emphysema, if you have just what we call the detoxification process called the flu, if you're a papaya, according to the head of the president of Tanzania, he was suspicious of the test, so he sent off a papaya and a goat and a sheep, and I think it was a pawpaw. The pawpaw and the goat tested positive and the sheep tested negative. So lots of things will cross-react with this test. So anybody who is sick will typically cross-react. And if you read the package insert of these coronavirus PCR tests, here's one from the CDC. Detection of viral RNA may not indicate the presence of infectious virus or that the 2019 nCoV virus is causative agent for clinical symptoms. The FDA says, quote, positive results do not rule out bacterial infections or co-infection with other viruses. The agent detected may not be the cause of the disease. The Roche PCR test, this is the test you're talking about, says, quote, these assays are not intended for use as an aid in the diagnosis of coronavirus infection. Let me say that again. The Roche test, one of the most widely used tests in the world, the package insert says you cannot use this test for the diagnosis of coronavirus infection. And I would love to ask the guy, so what should we use it for? Like toilet paper? Like, what is the purpose of a test that says clearly you cannot use this test for the diagnosis of the very thing that they're testing for? There is no test, PCR test, that's cleared for use as a diagnostic tool. The PCR test is a manufacturing tool. The founder of the PCR test, Kary Mullis, who was given a Nobel Prize in chemistry for creating this test, who to his dying day said, there is no evidence that my test can be used as a diagnostic test or to prove causation. And he said over and over again that the fact that they use this test to prove that HIV causes AIDS is a scientific travesty, because there is no evidence that this test can prove causation of any disease. It's simply a way to make more genetic material. It's a manufacturing tool. And it's been co-opted in one of the biggest scientific fraudulent scams of all time as a diagnostic test, which it isn't.
So it seems like a lot of people are going to be running to their local pharmacy or their doctors, lining up for this COVID-19 vaccine. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the first thing is it's hard to imagine how you can make a vaccine against a virus which you've never seen. So the virus hasn't been isolated, so it's basically we're talking about an imaginary virus, so it's hard to imagine how you could create a vaccine that would have any benefit against an imaginary or so-called theoretical. That was the word that Christian Drosten used in his paper. We use theoretical sequences from a theoretical virus. And I've often said to people, oh, here's a theoretical chair. Please have a seat. And as far as I know, nobody can sit on a theoretical chair or use a theoretical spoon to eat soup with. And you can't have a theoretical virus and make anybody sick. But the real problem is how the scientific so-called community reports data. And that's how they manipulate this. And that means we need to know what this concept called risk reduction means. And the best way to explain it is if you do a trial, and let's say all the controls and placebos were done properly, and so you have 10 people who you take a drug X to prevent heart attacks, and 10 people don't take drug X. At the end of a year, you see how many have heart attacks, and 2 in the placebo have heart attacks, and 1 out of 10 in the drug trial have a heart attack. Now, if you ask people, what is the benefit of taking that drug? Most people would say 10% of the people who took the drug had a heart attack, 20% of the people who didn't take the drug had a heart attack. The benefit is 10%, right? What do the scientists report? They say it's a 33% reduction. Now, how did they get that number? Because 1 plus 2 is 3, and 66% of the people who had heart attacks didn't take the drug versus 33% who did. That's a 33% difference. Now, what if you did 1 million people? So 1 out of 1 million people who took the drug had a heart attack, and 2 out of 1 million people who didn't take the drug have a heart attack. That's 0.0001%, I think. I may have got the zeros wrong, versus 0.002%. So what's the difference? Most rational people would say the difference is 0.001%. But what would a scientist say? They would say 33% reduction, because 1 plus 2 is 3, and 2 is 33% higher than 3. That 33% is biologically meaningless, because you could do 10 million, 100 million people, and it just would be meaningless, because nobody would take a drug that 1 out of 1 million people have a benefit from, especially because when they report the side effects, they'll say, well, say 10 out of, or 100 out of 1 million people have a side effect versus 10, so that's only a 0.009% reduction, so that's not a big deal. Now, what does this have to do with vaccines? The Moderna vaccine was reported a 94% efficacy against COVID-19. Now, the first thing to note in that trial is nothing they did had anything to do with the virus. They didn't even do PCR tests. They didn't do transmissibility. They didn't do antibody tests. They didn't do anything that had to do with the virus. All they did was say, who has symptoms at day 14 that suggest they have COVID-19? And they did approximately 15,000 people in each arm, placebo, which wasn't a placebo anyways, but let's say it was, versus the vaccine. And they said 90 out of the 15,000 who took the placebo got symptoms like COVID, and 5 out of the vaccine got symptoms that sounded like COVID. That's 0.6% of the people who didn't get the vaccine got symptoms versus 0.03% who did have the vaccine. That's a difference of 0.57%. So how did they get 94.5? Because 90 plus 5 is 95, and 90 is 94.5% of 95. That is an irrelevant conclusion, especially because it turns out that 2 to 3% got side effects from the vaccine, which were basically identical to the symptoms they were calling COVID. In other words, fever and myalgias, you're achy and you have a fever, approximately something like 600 compared to, 90 or 5 got symptoms from the vaccine as compared to almost none in the placebo. So the bottom line is, and they report that as, well, it was only like 0.4%. If they reported that in the same way, they would say there was a 600% increase in symptoms as a result of taking this vaccine. That's the facts. But they don't report it that way. And because of the way they did the trial, there was no possibility of it not working. Because they can put something in there that makes you have less symptoms, like a steroid. And so you have less symptoms. It has nothing to do with transmissibility, has nothing to do with the virus, has nothing to do with whether you're going to get sick again. And and they don't tell us what they're putting in there, so we don't really know. And this has nothing to do with even a vaccine. It has to do with putting a biologically active substance and injecting that into people. Now, a lot of people have actually tried to dissect based on the patents of what is in the Moderna vaccine. And it seems like there's some sort of a microchip or there's some sort of electroporation device which activates the chip. And this is a dangerous, unprecedented step for human beings to be actually, injected with something which may have something to do with electromagnetic frequencies. Now, I don't know for sure exactly what's in these because, like I say, they don't really report that accurately, but some people who've investigated this, and I would encourage people to look into it. There's a doctor named Christine Northrup who has looked into this, and she's given many interviews on what's exactly in these vaccines. So I would strongly encourage people to look into this.
There are different companies manufacturing their vaccines. What are your thoughts on the various brands?
So the question of Pfizer and all the other vaccines, they're all variations on a theme, but they're all, as I said, Pfizer doesn't have examples of the virus. So what kind of RNA are they using there? And what happens to the RNA? This is unprecedented in human history to inject pieces of genetic material like this into other human beings.
This is very worrying and scary. What are your thoughts about the future of COVID and the vaccines?
Yeah. So the question about what my outlook is, all I can say is in a TED Talk, I believe in 2015, Bill Gates, who has a lot to do with this, predicted that in the next pandemic, which he didn't say when, that 10 to 15% of the global population will die. That's 600 to 900 million people. That's somewhere between 20 and 50 million Americans. Now, is this going to happen? I don't know. But if there's some new biological toxin, which we haven't identified because we've been focused on the imaginary virus, my suggestion is people who hear me should look into this and see whether it's about time we clean up our environment, because I am not particularly optimistic if we don't wake up to what's happening. I, on the other hand, think that who's ever, behind this, and I have no idea, may have overplayed their hand here, and that people may not be willing to take this fraud anymore, in which case we have an amazing opportunity to create a different world. And I even have come to the point where I think there may be influences on this from other realms. Now, I'm no expert on what angelic realms or supersensible beings or gods or angels are or what they do, but I have a feeling, which is not a scientific conclusion, that this is a bigger deal than we think. And there may be spiritual entities or guides or helpers who may be very interested in helping us with this. And the problem is, nobody will help if you don't ask. And maybe we could finish with, this is also not new, because there is a story called Sleeping Beauty, where Sleeping Beauty was pricked by the virus of materialism, and the whole country went on lockdown. They were asleep. And Sleeping Beauty, which is essentially the image for the spiritual world coming to rejuvenate and inspire humanity, was asleep. And she was engulfed by a wall of thorns, toxic thorns, sort of like us. And nobody could come and save her. And different kings and princes and different people tried to save her. They were all engulfed and killed by the thorns. Until one prince heard about the story, young man, and said, "I can do this." And they said, "No, you can't do this. They'll be killed like all the other ones." And you know what he said? He said, "I can do this. I'm not afraid." And because he said he wasn't afraid, the thorns parted, and so it was easy. They didn't interfere with him. He went in, he woke up Sleeping Beauty, and the kingdom was restored to health and prosperity. So this is an issue of fear. If we allow ourselves to be afraid, we have no chance. If we can summon up the courage, it's a piece of cake.
Dr. Cowan, thanks so very much for taking your time to share your thoughts and views with us. That completes my interview with Dr. Thomas Cowan. I love original thinkers. I love people who are willing to look at things differently. I believe they lead us to a better future, and that's exactly who this gentleman is, and I was happy to share his interview with you. That concludes episode 6 of our 9-episode series, Vaccines Revealed COVID Edition. What a journey we've been on, and we're not nearly done yet. We have more episodes, more interviews to bring you, so hang in there with us, dig into this, learn this information. I am sure it's already started conversations for you amongst family, friends, and colleagues. You need to understand this information and share it, especially with people that you care about. And along those lines, I want to encourage you to invest in this series. By investing in it, you are also supporting our mission in getting this out to the world. It helps give us the resources to not only produce this content, but just as importantly, to disseminate it, to get people to know about it, to experience it. So we're still in the free viewing period, but the series is available for you to own. We have different packages. Find the right one for you. Know that there are bonuses there that you'll be interested in. We've made it extremely affordable. And just know that when you invest and own, you have our thanks. You have our gratitude. It says a lot, and it supports us. We care about this mission and getting this out there, and we thank you for caring about it also. I will see you in episode 7.
I think it's the height of irresponsibility that our public health officials didn't have a press conference and say, we've got some updated information. If you're not over 80 years old, 70 years old, and you don't have serious comorbidities, and you're not from Wuhan in the months when we first discovered this virus, you're probably going to be just fine. They never said that. They also did way too much of the high-pressure, protocol-driven ventilating. There were people that were talking and walking and said, we got to get you on a ventilator right now. Why? I'm fine. Medical errors were the third leading cause of death up until 2019. Misdiagnosis of COVID and mistreatment of people that didn't have COVID and killing them on ventilators or killing them because they develop extrahepatic pneumonia, sepsis, and all the rest, has made medical error the number one cause of death in the United States.
Who would have known that the number one and the number two leading causes of death in the industrialized world, cancer and heart disease, that the solution for those two disease processes was COVID? Because nobody's dying of heart disease and cancer anymore. It's all COVID. Testing doesn't mean that you have a problem. In fact, the PCR test was developed by a doctor by the name of Kerry Mullis, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his development of the PCR test. Kerry Mullis himself said you cannot use it to diagnose an infectious process or a pathogenic issue. It's picking up a signature, that's all. If you amplify the test enough, everybody's going to test positive for it.